Hello there. You are listening to KPCALP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM. You are here on State of the Union with DG the 30-something. And I always like to start by giving a little bit of a plug. So we are a community radio station and rely on the community support in order to keep going. So please, if you would like to become a member, come do that. If you would like to be a friend of the organization, you can also do that as well and make a donation to the organization. I always say that I think community radio is important to the maintenance of democracy in this country because we're giving people a voice, and it's anyone in the community, whether you have a musical voice or if you want to do a talk show or whatever you want to do. This is an amazing community resource that a lot of communities don't have, so please take advantage of it. And if you can, please donate, because that is how we function. So, as I said, you are here with DG the 30-something. So I know I have new viewers most recently because I've been getting some feedback. And so I always like to, I think I've been doing my show for almost 2 years now. It was on accident. I did a review of Jared Huffman's town hall meeting in Petaluma on healthcare. And ever since then, I have had a radio show. I never thought that I was going to be on any radio station, let alone this one. And if you're watching on Facebook, you can see my face live. So the main reason that I was charged with doing a response to Jared Huffman's town hall is because my background's in public health and my entire career is in government. So my show is a nonpartisan government analysis show. I most recently completed interviews with all the candidates for all those candidates that came into the studio for city council and mayor in the city of Petaluma, which is actually kind of a little different for my show. So my show is generally a nonpartisan policy analysis show where I like to pick out issues and policies that are affecting both the nation in general as well as, of course, the local community. And so that is why today we are talking about the current government shutdown. I know that it is a huge hot button issue for people, and I'm going to go through kind of how government shutdowns happen, the history, as well as the monetary impact, and then in the end, I always do my own analysis of the entire subject matter. So, that's pretty much the intro to me. That's the intro to the show. I always say I forgot my iPad, so I can't take questions during the show. I usually always take questions during the show. But you can email me. You can comment on Facebook if you're watching on Facebook. And then you can also email me at domayne@maberme.com. And I can answer your questions to the best of my ability, or I can connect you with information that is necessary. That's something that I take great pride in, is be able to connect people with information, because I want to make sure that your questions, people feel empowered to be civically engaged and their questions are answered. So let's get into it. And I always say that I'm very accessible, so I just like to add that. I answer all my emails, I answer all the questions and all that kind of stuff. So please, if you have questions or if you have topics that you'd like to talk about, please send them over, because I'm always looking for ideas. So, the government shutdown. So I want to just start by talking about the process, because I was not completely familiar with the process of how a shutdown works. And so I wanted to make sure that I started there so that all of us together can learn about how shutdowns actually work and how they occur. So government shutdowns occur when Congress fails to pass sufficient appropriation bills or continuing resolutions to fund government operations. And then the other instance is when the president refuses to sign bills into law. So I wanted to start by talking about appropriation funding, what that means. So it is as it sounds. So it's legislation to appropriate federal funding. And so the main difference between appropriation and continuation is appropriation is new budgeting measures for federal funding, and continuation is, as it sounds, it's continuing of current funding. So when the shutdowns occur, it means that neither the appropriation or continue, one or the other, or both. In this situation, I think it ended up being both. So the appropriation or the continuing resolutions couldn't be passed. Or we'll get more into the specific situation that we're in now later. But I just wanted to define both those things. So again, appropriation is funding, is legislation that basically hashes out funding to the different federal departments and programs and says this program is going to get this much money, this program is going to get this much money, and this is what they're going to do for it. And then continuation is continuation of current funding and programs. And again, I'll get into some more specifics of what that looks like. So all of this is in compliance with the Anti-Deficiency Act. And so I wanted to define what that was. Again, this was something that I wasn't familiar with, so I thought it was really important to share what it meant. So this legislation was enacted to prevent the incurring of the words. It's so many legally. So basically it prevents spending beyond the obligations or the expenditures during the current appropriation. So if the last appropriation of funding was decided on last year, then this act says that you can't expend money above that appropriated funding amount prior. So basically, you can't spend more money than was already agreed upon. So if Congress can't agree upon the next appropriation of funding or the next pot of funding, then the government has to shut down. And I think that this was originally enacted as a protection because we have the triad and we have our measures that keep our system going and transparent and working from different angles. But as I'll get into later, I think that this legislation has been taken advantage of because a disagreement shutting down our government is a huge issue. So again, I think that the Anti-Deficiency Act was passed in for good reason, so that we aren't spending money more than has already been budgeted for, is really what we're talking about here. But at the same time, it can be used against the American people. And I would suggest, well, I'll talk about this later, but I would suggest that this act be looked at and how it's defined and how it's treated. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the most recent history of shutdowns. And I didn't go back. During Reagan's administration, I think there was a total of 4 shutdowns for various reasons. But I just gave you the history. During Reagan, there was 4. I don't think any of them were more than 3 days. 3 or 4 days, I think, was the shutdown period for that. But I did want to get into other shutdowns, starting with, I call him Daddy Bush, but Bush Sr. So he had a shutdown in 1990. And so again, the shutdowns, I think, they're all based on disagreements, really, is the best way to put it. For one reason or the other, there's disagreements about how legislation should be passed and how funding should be appropriated. So during Daddy Bush's administration, there was a shutdown. It was only for a weekend, which is hardly a shutdown in my opinion. It's, no one's working anyway on the weekends. The federal government, if you work with the federal government, you know that. They barely work on Fridays. And then during the Clinton administration, there was a shutdown in both 1995 and 1996. They were 15 and 20 days respectively. So 1995 was 15 days. 1996, it was 21 days. Those are pretty substantial shutdowns. But again, there was disagreements about how things were going to go down and how funding was going to be distributed. In 2013, during Obama's administration, there was a shutdown of 16 days due to the Affordable Care Act. The bodies of Congress could not come to an agreement about whether that was going to be enacted or not. And random factoid, during the shutdown, I was very depressed because they got rid of the Census app, and I'm a data junkie, and so it was very sad because it never came back. Unless someone can correct me, but as far as I know, the Census app never came back, and it was a super cool application if you deal with any sort of vital statistics or data. So I was really sad about that, and it hasn't come back. So now that brings us to, and you know, a little bit more about the Obama administration shutdown. I think it goes to show where first the piece of legislation was picked apart by many people in Congress at the federal level. I mean, we know that at all levels of government it was picked apart, but it was picked apart first and changed and manipulated and however you want to look at it. And then when it came before, like I said, it came before and it caused a 16-day shutdown because there was a refusal to accept, even after all these changes had occurred, there was a refusal to pass the legislation. And this comes back to the Anti-Deficiency Act, where I think that there's a lot of flaws in shutting down the government because of a disagreement. Now, to some extent, I understand the rationale of why we're shutting down the government for disagreement, but it seems kind of silly. It's like saying that a bunch of 3-year-olds in a preschool classroom, if they get in a disagreement, the whole school has to shut down. So I think that there needs to be some amendments to how we think about these things. And again, I don't think it's an easy situation, because if things are split 50-50, or if you can't come to a conclusion, but as the American people, as we'll see as I continue with the radio show, there needs to be a little bit more transparency and accountability for the people that are in office, regardless of if they are your immediate representation or not. There needs to be some accountability for not being able to shut down our government for 32 days. So Donald Trump already has had 2 shutdowns in his tenure. 3. So there was 2 shutdowns in 2018. One was 3 days and one was overnight. And then the one that we're here to talk about today started in December of 2018. It's currently been, I have down here 31 days, but I think technically today it's 32 days. It's the longest in the history of the United States. And it's about building the wall in between Mexico and the United States. And the tab for that wall is $5.7 billion. And in this instance, it was because the president refused to sign the appropriations bill without the wall funding. So it was passed through our system that the other funding was going to be appropriated, all of it. I mean, we're talking about a lot of money that's appropriated, departments all over the federal government. But because it didn't include funding for the wall, it was denied by our president. And so that is why we're in the situation we're in. And there's been a bipartisan effort to stop the shutdown because it's affecting so many people, and it just because one line item isn't in there is kind of an interesting situation to cause or not only to cause a shutdown, but to keep a shutdown occurring in the current time. So anyway, we'll get to how I feel about that at the end. So some of the departments, so right now 800,000 employees that work under the federal government are affected. And some of the departments that are affected are the Department of the State and the Department of Transportation, which is all the news you've been seeing about the TSA being not paid. So that's the TSA is covered under that. The Department of Agriculture. And this one for me in public health is a really hard one. Other departments have been hit too, but there is a 95% furlough of employees. So furloughs are either forced time off or, you're not getting paid for a certain amount of time. So basically, and so it's the USDA Food and Nutrition Services. So the USDA controls, for example, something on the ground that the USDA controls is they control requirements for schools, the food and nutrition requirements for schools, and the biggest one that people were concerned about is the SNAP benefits, so formerly known as food stamps, but now it's called SNAP. And so far it hasn't been directly affected as far as I've seen. And so, but there's always running that risk because you have 95% furloughs. So the idea would be, and California is taking different measures than the rest of the country in order to support California residents. But my show just isn't about California. So we do have to consider our brothers and sisters in other states. And if there is going to be an issue with processing SNAP benefits, so if you're talking about all these employees, and SNAP benefits are processed at a state and county level, but if you're talking about all these furloughs, then it's hard to get the money or the processing from the federal government down to the state and county in order to make sure that people have benefits that they qualify for. So the justice system is one that is being affected by the shutdown, which is one of the most concerning departments for me to be shut down. So there are protections for judges, and obviously we know there's protections for the Supreme Court because they're making decisions, even just today, about transgender military personnel not being allowed. So the Supreme Court made a decision. I don't know if they made the decision today, but it was enacted today. So we know that they're still working over there. Ruth Bader Ginsburg biography was just also nominated for an Oscar, just in case you were wondering, speaking of the Supreme Court. So this is really concerning that the Justice Department is affected by this shutdown because it's something that we rely on. It's one of our triad of control in this country, is that whole judicial system. So one of the examples of people that aren't being paid are court-appointed lawyers to those that, if you watch Cops like I do, you hear this whole spiel about if you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. So those appointed attorneys are working right now without pay. And they're already not paid very much with respect to what attorneys get paid. So they're not being paid right now. So the Department of the Interior. Now, the Department of the Interior, I think, is one of the lesser understood departments in the government, and I'm one of those people that didn't understand. They kind of have like a crapshoot of things they control or manage. So the Department of Interior controls federal lands, national resources, and then Alaska Native and American Indian Services. So I learned about the Department of Interior when I worked for a tribe last year, but I think that I don't think that a lot of people understand this Department of Interior that manages it, but I think that a lot of people have seen about the federal parks and resources, that they're being shut down because they can't even pay their employees to pick up the garbage in the parks, and they can't be maintained. And I failed to mention before when I defined shutdowns about how the government defined shutdowns as unnecessary operational positions. So there's necessary positions, just like the justice system, where we're like, oh, yeah, well, the Supreme Court has to work. But there's this definition of unnecessary positions. So that in itself is kind of degrading. So federal lands, natural resources, like I said, a lot of the federal parks are being shut down or, being affected because they literally can't be cleaned up. So that's part of the issue. Now the tribes. The tribes is a very interesting, and it falls, I assume it's the Department of Interior because it falls under federal lands. But the tribes are being hit very hard. So they are technically on federal lands, and a lot of the departments fall under the Department of Interior that deal with our native populations, whether it's Native American or Native Alaskan. And I've already gotten reports that there are tribes that are having to lay off their employees and decrease their administration and do furloughs. Like a lot of the departments doing furloughs because they can't get the funding that they rely on. And tribes are and then some, tribes rely on Indian Health Services, Bureau of Indian Affairs, as well as many other federal funding, state funding, federal funding, primarily federal funding. So this Department of Justice, I know the tribe I work for had quite a significant amount of money from the Department of Justice. And so when you talk about whether it's furloughs, and so there's grant managers at the federal level that manage the funding. And if you don't have that anymore, or if they're not working, then the tribes really get hit. And tribes already, they have the worst health outcomes in the entire country. I think I saw, and someone can correct me, but I'm pretty sure I saw that, so tribes get commodity boxes still, which is a box of food. Well, speaking of the USDA, so they're sending out a commodity box. They're called commods, and it has their allotment of food for, I think, the week. And so it's kind of like SNAP benefits, but it comes directly to the tribe. And if you've seen some of the food, I don't know if you've seen some of the food, but it is not good food. It's nasty. They've made it better. They've made it better in the last few years with having produce and stuff. But anyway, my point in bringing that up is that I've actually seen reports now that tribes aren't even getting that. So now we're talking about, and the thing with SNAP benefits is that if you're a rural tribe, if your tribe isn't running its own food bank or its own SNAP situation, then it's going to be really hard to get there. Because a lot of tribal members, they don't drive, they don't have cars, they're in rural locations. The state of California has a very unique tribal situation because, which is not recognized very well by the federal government. But in Northern California, for example, during the genocide and during this whole reservation reform, I've talked a lot about this in other of my radio shows, but during this whole reform and the reservations, the tribes were actually separated. So what would have been potentially the same tribe or, friendly sects of the same tribe in different areas were formally separated onto different reservations and lands. And so a lot of them are in rural locations, and they don't have the power of a Navajo Nation or one of these. So Navajo Nation is one of the largest in the country. And then you have Cherokee, Choctaw. You have other really large tribes. But in Northern California, the tribes were split into very, very small tribes relatively. We're talking like, 1,000 members, 1,500 members. And so they don't have quite the power or the infrastructure to serve their populations in the same way. So I know, actually, I just saw a post today. And again, I am making an assumption that it's true, which I wouldn't doubt it's true. But the Navajo Nation is actually accepting non-tribal members to get WIC benefits that are affected by this shutdown. Or even if you wouldn't normally qualify for WIC, but you haven't gotten paychecks, like a lot of people haven't gotten paychecks, then you can get WIC benefits. And that's women, infant, and children. So their benefits that's what WIC stands for. So their benefits to get the basic needs for your children. And so the larger tribes are actually stepping up and saying, because they have their own determination to serve the populations that they deem necessary. And then even within the federal funding, they're allowed to serve a certain percentage of non-Native people, even if they're relying on that. Now, Navajo Nation has there's a reason it's called Navajo Nation, is because it really is its own nation. It's very large. They have a lot of economic development. So I bring all this up because the tribes are so oftenly overshadowed, and they do show up quite a bit in times of need for other populations, even though in this country we frankly neglect the tribal populations. But there are a lot of smaller tribes that are being greatly affected. I mean, to the point, we're talking about 32 days. It doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're not getting your funding that your tribe relies on for 32 days, you could, again, a lot of tribes, people are out of the job. Like, they have no choice because they're not getting their funding from BIA or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or they're not getting the interfacing with Indian Health Services that they would deem necessary, or they're not able to call their grant managers, the Department of Justice, because they're under furloughs. So those are all major issues, and I really wanted to highlight that. Again, I work for a tribe, and I've worked in unison with a lot of tribes, and I know a lot of tribal members, and so this has been a huge issue for tribes, and again, it's never brought to the forefront, so I always like bringing up tribes. So, and then while the departments are not completely shut down, there are furloughs in the Department of Education and Health and Human Services. So again, Health and Human Services is one of my areas of expertise because my background in public health. But they fund, the Department of Education, I think, is intuitive. We don't want the Department of Education not working. Health and Human Services, again, semi-intuitive, but they fund so much programming all over the country that those furloughs, again, it's everything down to trying to communicate with your grant managers. If you have funding, your contract and grant managers. And I should say that a lot of agencies, small government agencies, as well as tribes, they apply for contract. They do request for proposal responses to HHS or the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy too. The Department of Education in order to get funding to run their programming. So when furloughs occur, not only is there an issue with being able to manage the funding because you can't get a hold of the person that's supposed to be helping you manage the funding, but there also can be issues with receiving the funding. And it all goes back to where we started about the appropriation of funding. If there can't be an agreement or the president refuses to sign the bill that's already been passed, which is our current situation, then all of these appropriations across the board that have already been established, so Congress has made a decision about how they want to allot the funding, but there's a refusal by the president to sign it, then that means that all of these departments and all of this funding that is supposed to be passed down to the agencies, however you want to look at it, is halted. And actually, I learned today that the Small Business Administration actually has been shut down. And that's something that hits really close to home for me because I own a small company. And there are companies that get assistance and grants and funding from the Small Business Administration. And so when the Small Business Administration is shut down, those companies, agencies, individuals are not getting, not only are they not getting the assistance, they're not getting the funding. And, you know, it's rough because I'm on the leadership council for the National Small Business Association, which is a separate entity, but there was this enthusiasm before the last election because there was all this promise for economic and business development. But then after the administration came into play, the tune changed quite a bit because we got this list in an email of everything that was going to be defunded. And what I think one of the major disconnects is, even with other small businesses, is that there are a lot of small businesses that rely solely on government contracts. There are many, many, many a company that do that. And I remember I was on some of the calls because I'm on the technology advisory committee for the Small Business Administration. And there was these people that were frantic because there was already defunding of all these departments. So well before the shutdown, there was defunding of all these departments. And one of the major ones that I remember is the Department of Energy, because there's so many new energy companies that are solely reliant on government funding because it's the research and development. They're funding research and development. So it was the Department of Energy funding that had been halted, and you had companies just frantic, like, what am I supposed to do if all this funding is halted? And they were already in that predicament. And then there's a lot of universities and scientific institutions whose funding was halted, again, for research and development. So there's a lot of research and development funding that was halted during this time period. And a lot of that funding goes to like universities and, again, other research institutions. And so that's already how the administration started, was under this situation where all these departments were being defunded. And again, I've done several shows on other departments that were defunded. Health and Human Services, Preventative Care Services was greatly defunded, and my whole argument with that. And I think it's the same with the Department of Energy. I think all of these contribute to people's public health. The Department of Energy is environment and built environment. And so it very much intersects with Health and Human Services, because a lot of Department of Energy small businesses are trying to provide a better solution for health and wellness, really is what it is, because alternative energy affects the environment. And so really in the end, it's about health and wellness. And so preventative services were already defunded across the board in all the departments right as soon as the administration started. And I talked a lot about when it happened, about that people being sick helps a lot of companies be rich. And so keeping people sick can help certain interests advance in this country. So, and I think that's what a lot of the administration was looking to do. And it seems backward. It seems really backwards, because we see that people being healthy, it increases GDP and productivity, but there's something really backwards about how this country has created medical care as a business. And so you make way more money if people aren't healthy than they are. And we've failed to enact certain incentives and stuff like other countries, where I think it's in England, for example, or that you get incentives for how healthy your patients are, or if they become more healthy during your stay. Like, that's something that's completely unheard of in this country. So all of that had already been defunded, and now we're in a shutdown where all these departments are being affected by a shutdown. So it's not even just being defunded, it's like adding insult to injury. So they were already defunded, and now we're saying, like, okay, well, we're just going to completely shut down the department. So let's talk about the economic impact, because I think it's something that's lesser talked about, and to me, it's the most important thing to talk about, is the economic impact, because the current administration doesn't want to admit that there's an economic impact to this whole situation, which is, it's gonna be interesting when you hear it. I thought it was interesting. So there's already been a $3.6 billion loss, and that was reported by S&P. So there has been a decrease in economic growth by 0.13% each week, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it adds up quickly, and it means that we're not experiencing growth. We're losing growth. The furlough of 257,000 employees and contractors in the DC area alone. So we know, of course, or I hope people know, that the governmental employees and contractors are very high concentrated in the DC area. It's affecting the regional economy by $119 million a day. And that has to do with people being able to live, eat, play, all that kind of stuff in the area. When they're not getting paid, they can't do that. And that is 7.3% of the regional output. So DC, again, it's a highly concentrated area of government employee. I can't remember. I should have looked it up. I looked it up when I was in DC of what percentage of employee. I want to say it's like around 30% of DC is government employees, but don't quote me on that. But I feel like it's somewhere around that. It's a very large amount of DC residents that work for the government. And so that's why you can see why they're losing $119 million a day. In DC alone, the GDP has decreased by $2.8 billion. And that was as reported by Express newspaper, which is a local newspaper in DC. And so I think what the most important parallel to make here is that this $5.7 billion wall has now cost the DC area alone $2.8 billion. Just DC. That's the decrease in GDP. Just DC. And nationwide, we've had a $3.6 billion loss. So sure, there's a $2 billion difference, but this shutdown's not over. So if we've lost $3.6 billion in 32 days, how long is this going to go on? I mean, it's laughable. It doesn't make sense. So you're making the country lose $3.6 billion to try to fund your $5.7 billion wall, while also putting so many people and programs in danger. Like I said, with the tribes, we're talking not just minor danger. Like, they are having to close their doors and their programs, and they're not getting by. So here we get into what I call the power play. Now, I think this was an incredibly irrational decision by the administration, but I think we all can, I think many of us can agree that it's not shocking that the administration made an irrational decision at this point in time. And I think it is, the reason I call it a power play in quote marks is because I think that's exactly what it was. I don't think it shows that anyone's powerful in this circumstance, but I think this is all an ego-based power play in order to show that even despite the fact that the Congress might have 100% agreed, and we're talking about, there have been bipartisan agreements about stopping the shutdown, and none of it seems to have an impact. And so I would like to give as much credit to our president to say that he's trying to adhere to one of his campaign promises, but I don't even think he's that smart. And so I'm really good at analysis of these situations, and I'm almost at a loss with this one, because we have our Coast Guard that's not getting paid. We have our TSA that's not getting paid. We have many other military personnel that are not getting paid. And they're forced to work. Like, that's the thing is, like in the, I think one of the examples of, so unnecessary people don't have to work, but when you talk about military personnel, Coast Guard, all those kind of things, those are considered necessary personnel. So they're being forced to work. And then everyone in the veterans hospitals, that was another one. So if you're a direct caregiver, so like a doctor or a nurse, if you're working in the veterans hospitals, which these people are already making a huge commitment to work in a veterans hospital, which is a great thing. None of them are getting paid. And they're forced to work. You have to work. You don't have a choice. Because it's considered necessary. It's an exemption to the unnecessary. So it's a necessary, but you're not going to get paid kind of situation. And I think everyone's seen the posts about how the Coast Guard is having to go, like I said, going and getting WIC benefits, again, women, infant, and children benefits from tribes or other sources. And I think the state of California is doing their due diligence to make sure that these populations are covered. But again, I always have to remember and speak to the other states that don't have the benefits that the state of California does, because those are big things. But I'm almost at a loss in this one, because I would never, my question always is to those who are not being paid that are Trump supporters, because I would like to hear what they have to say and how they continue to support someone that has caused a shutdown. And perhaps it's because they think this wall is so important that they're willing to not get a paycheck. I don't know. I'm interested to know. I would like to have a conversation with someone that is still, and I don't, it's not one person, it's the administration. So I'm not the kind of person that walks around and says, oh, Trump is this terrible. I mean, I might think that, but I don't blame him. It's his administration. It's like a Manchurian Candidate situation. If you haven't seen that movie, you should see it, because it's so unexplainable how you could carry something on based on a quote campaign promise. That doesn't make any sense, because the criminals and all these are not immigrants. They're not the majority of our criminals. They're white men are the majority of our criminals and murderers and rapists. And I don't hate to be brash. I always joke that I hate to be brash. I don't hate to be brash. That's statistics. You can look that up. And so this whole idea and this play on this idea, and I thought that it would change people's minds. They're not getting paid, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Like, they're just fine not being paid. And so, like I said, I have a hard time analyzing this situation, because what's the point? I think it's this carelessness, and we've seen time and time again with the appointees into this administration that they have no idea what they're doing in their position. And I think that's intentional. And it kind of goes back to this control situation. And I've talked a lot about it over the last 2 years, about this idea of totalitarian rule. And this is something I studied in college, if you have not been following me. And it's this idea that while people are suppressed, they can be controlled. And so we're in a literal situation where people aren't getting paid, and so they can be controlled. And I'm very lucky, because I'm not a federal government employee. But my heart goes out to my brothers and sisters that are blatantly being controlled by this administration's decisions. And and they're still getting paid. And I can't really blame the Senate and the House of Representatives. I can't really blame Congress because they're still getting paid, but they also are making a huge effort to stop this. So I don't, I know a lot of people are posting that the politicians shouldn't get paid, but they're doing their best to stop this. There has been bipartisan movements since, I don't know, almost since the beginning to try to stop this. No one wants to see their constituency not being paid, being forced to work and not being paid. I would hope that any human would want that. We know that our current administration does not have humanity within their bone structure. But what's the answer? What's the solution? I don't know. Despite all the media coverage, despite everything and all the fight back, when is the government going to be put up again? I ask this question to myself every morning when I wake up, and obviously we all hope it's soon. What's it going to take? What is it going to take? What is it going to take in this administration? I don't know. I was just at an MLK event yesterday, and we had a lot of our representatives speak, and they have a lot of great things to say, and I know they're working really hard. But like I said, Congress in general, like the House and the Senate in general, has come into an agreement that the shutdown is not okay. But we have a president who is not thinking on his own. He is not acting on his own. There is a whole agenda behind this that none of us really understand. I don't understand it, and I'm generally pretty good at reading between the lines. I don't understand it. I think it's irrational. And so, what's going to happen? This can't go on too much longer. I can't presume it can go on too much longer. The Congress has made it very clear that they're not going to pass appropriations to build the wall, which would be completely ridiculous. But we're about to soon. What is it going to take 10 days? We're going to lose more money than the wall costs. But I don't even think our current president can read a set of financials, let alone make an educated opinion about what this really looks like and the effect on GDP and our growth and our economy, and that the entire world's laughing at us right now. So, and again, you can support President Trump as much as you want to. I would love to sit down and have a conversation with you after this shutdown to hear about why you continue to support someone that is willing to force people to work and not be paid. Like, I have a flight on February 9th, and it was kind of a joke, but earlier today we were talking about, well, you better show up 4 hours before your flight because God knows how you're going to get through TSA. But again, in California, there has been a lot of movement to pay government employees in order to make sure that there isn't this loss or this issue. But I would never want to see military... We've come so far. Like, after the Vietnam War, where the veterans were not taken care of in a great manner, and even after that, even after the Iraq War... our services were still really faltering. Like, I hate watching our military not being able to pay their bills because they're not getting paid. And there's plenty of them, I'm sure, that live paycheck to paycheck. There's plenty that don't live paycheck to paycheck and they do just fine. But there are plenty that I know live paycheck to paycheck, like the rest of us. There's many people that live paycheck. There's TSA agents that live paycheck. There's HHS employees that live paycheck to paycheck. The Department of the Interior, there's tribal employees that live paycheck. And not only do tribal employees live paycheck to paycheck, their entire departments are being shut down because they can't get money from... a month is a long time. And then not having your USDA... the United States Department of Agriculture, not having your food and nutrition services in place. What does that really look like? Like, what kind of a nation are we living in where we have all these, and these are just some examples of departments that are shut down and in furloughs. This isn't everything. And the 800,000 employees that are dealing with it, That's a lot of people. And that's just, that's not even, I don't think that even includes all the military personnel and everything. That it just talks about the certain administrative departments that are affected. So we're talking about a lot of people that are being affected by this. And I mean, again, I wish I had my other device like I usually do so I could see people's comments and questions. But if there is a Trump supporter out there that is not being paid at the moment, that would like to sit down and have a conversation with me about that, I would love to do that. Because I want to understand what that looks like. Because I don't understand what it looks like. I'm not directly affected. A lot of my colleagues are, though. A lot of my colleagues, because I work in government, are being affected by this. I have one colleague who was telling me, she's an attorney, but she was telling me she's a tribal member. And so she was just telling me about her tribe is basically at the moment having to lay everyone off. And they're having to do all these furloughs. And, you know, they're going through all these measures to have to deal with this stuff. And you're talking about populations of people that now all of a sudden, like overnight, I mean, a month. But when you talk about years of services, it's basically overnight. Everything's gone. Everything's gone for you. The employees are gone that used to service you. Your programs are gone. And then obviously the hope is that those people can be employed again very quickly and soon. But I mean, where are we at as a nation? And I think, you know, I want to go back to this whole idea of the Anti-Deficiency Act. I think that it needs to be looked at again. I obviously totally understand why we can't incur expenses over what was budgeted or appropriated. But I also think that there needs to be some checks and balances about how long the president can refuse to sign legislation that's been passed through. I mean, there's definitely a gap in checks and balances in this situation as far as I'm concerned, because this can't go on this long. Or maybe there's a time frame where it says, okay, everyone needs to come to an agreement by this time, because we can't have government. I mean, what if this government shutdown goes for months? Like, then what? You know, what does that look like? I don't know. And it's stressful, even as someone that's not affected by it. It's very stressful. So anyway, please send over your questions to me. Again, if you're watching on Facebook, you know how to do questions and comments. If you have questions, again, please email me at domayne@maberme.com. One of my major goals in life is to connect people with information. So if I don't have the answer, I can connect you to the answer. I also always cite my sources. I might have not done a great job doing it during the show, but as I always say, I don't make up information. So, and again, I like to reiterate that please support your local radio station, because if you didn't, then I wouldn't be here being able to do this with you. And again, you are listening to State of the Union with DG the 30-something. I will be back in 2 weeks on Thursday, I believe. Yes, I'll be back 2 days on Thursday. I'm going to India, so there will be a period of time where I'm gone for a couple weeks, but I will keep you posted. Again, you can follow me on Facebook, or the KPCA website has the ongoing links and schedules. So please check that out. Also support my fellow programmers. And my alternating partner in crime is Al Scardino, and he has his show on lifestyle choices every other Tuesday. So please check that out and follow us both. I will see you next time.